Today's guest has blown my mind with the way she thinks about business and culture. Imagine changing the way we lead from being something we feel like we have to push and control to being something that we encourage. Treating business like an ecosystem where there are conditions for people to thrive. Sara van Rensburg is the former CEO of CTLF, is an organizational strategist, and pushes leaders like us to think differently. Sara van Rensburg, welcome to How I Turned the Corner.
Thank you, Kendra. It's nice to be here.
So tell us a little bit about this idea of business as an ecosystem. It's kind of an unusual concept.
The movement of regenerative organizational design has been around for a long time. I mean, back in the 70s, it even took a swing upward. And I think it's being adopted now because organizations understand that we can't just keep pushing for outcomes over and over, endlessly wanting more and more when we live in a finite world with finite resources. The earth is finite. Our own personal energy is finite. We need to understand some of the patterns from living systems and what we see in a healthy ecosystem in order to be able to get a different kind of outcome, a different kind of result. So regenerative leadership, regenerative organizations focus on creating the conditions for health and abundance to be naturally recurring outcomes instead of something that we have to force and push and prod. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So how, as leaders, what's different as a leader to have more of a regenerative ecosystem in our businesses? What do we do differently as leaders?
I think one of the biggest pieces to what I just said about the definition, naturally recurring outcomes are not something most organizations have. Instead, we have to use great effort to try to get predictable productivity, efficiency, in order so that the leader can predict and see what's coming around the corner. And we are in a world right now with unprecedented change. I mean, there's no way that we can know all the variables we're dealing with, let alone be able to manage them well enough in advance and predict what's going to happen so that we can get those outcomes over and over. And that's why organizations are experiencing so much turmoil, ups, downs. A goal was expected and something undermined it. And next thing you know, companies are scrambling to try to make up for the outcomes that weren't produced before. And I bring this up because I think what's needed instead of that is a focus on two things: health and abundance. And by abundance, it really is this concept that an organization is able to achieve the purpose that they set out, that purpose can be realized in the world in more ways than they can predict. So back to your point about ecosystems. I live up at the very top of Coal Creek Canyon in Colorado. And in this ecosystem, there are trees and shrubs and moose and deer, and all of this naturally happens without me having to do anything. The shrubs that grow, the aspen trees, every year they produce leaves, they are healthy, they are strong, and I don't have to do anything for it because they are naturally recurring outcomes out of the health of this ecosystem. And so in an organization, we need to be really clear, what kind of environment are we trying to create? What kind of ecosystem do we want to have? What is it like? Is it entrepreneurial? Is it slow and steady wins the race? Is it very relationship driven? Is it everyone has the ability to be independent and to make their own decisions? Because if we're not clear what kind of ecosystem we're trying to create, then we're going to have people on our team who don't know if they fit. They don't know how to contribute. They may think it's one thing, and then they realize based on decisions that are being made that they're in a different environment than they realized. And so it's not possible for people to thrive unless they truly understand what kind of environment that they're in.
So would you liken that? So a lot of our podcast interviews we've focused a lot over the last year and a half about about values. And I've been cynical many, many years about values until I started to connect it to kind of what you just said, which is really even just the behaviors we want from people. But I like the way you're saying this is, what kind of an ecosystem do we want? It still ties back to then what are the behaviors that come out of an entrepreneurial environment or a slow and steady environment or accidentally a toxic environment, right? Yeah. And so is that how you would talk about this as well as in kind of more common speak, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that an organization needs to have values that are clearly defined, but I also recognize it's not enough for those values to be said and told by the people at the top of an organization. Hey, this is what we believe in. It's written on the website. I told you once. That it reminds me of when I was early married, my husband, he just didn't even think about time. And one time, like, do you even love me? He's like, what do you mean? Of course I love you. He goes, why do you ask? And I said, well, you don't say it very often. He's like, what? I don't say it. And it reminds me of that joke, I told you I love you once. If I change my mind, I'll let you know. I think organizations do that all the time, and they don't understand why those values don't mean anything to people. And this past year, I was able to work with a team, and I didn't have the decision-making ability I had with all the roles of senior leadership in the past. We were flat. We all were equal. And it was an awakening for me because I realized, like, wait a minute, how am I supposed to know what the context is, the purpose, the values, the strategies, unless I'm a part of it? Because until I get to sink my teeth into it and understand it for myself internally in my own words and know what that means to how I show up, it doesn't matter. And I think that's where organizations fall short. They create the conditions for people to know the values, but not for them to live them. And that's a wholly different thing.
So let's talk then. Let's take a specific one that you just brought up, like an entrepreneurial ecosystem. What would the context be? What would be the things people could sink their teeth into to basically live the values every day? Like, what would be some concrete examples?
In an entrepreneurial ecosystem, we're talking about rapid iteration. Like, it's a birth phase. If you think about the cycle all living things go through: birth, growth, death, decay. Entrepreneurial organizations are starting something new. This is all about planting brand new seeds, germinating them, letting them grow, tilling the soil. Oh, that didn't work. Let me try something new. And so if an organization wants to be entrepreneurial, and they're going to be rewarding things like rapid communication and ideating and moving through things quickly, lots of disturbance, versus if an organization is beyond that and they want steady growth, that kind of behavior would undermine, like, somebody coming in constantly creating change for something that we're trying to just let it grow. And so that distinction makes a huge difference for how someone should behave and what kind of person would fit that ecosystem.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so that's kind of the boundaries and of the values, and then the way we live those every day. What are other components that come into this from a leadership perspective? You mentioned like context. What do you mean by that?
Context includes things like purpose. It's basically, what does your organization believe in? What does it exist to do in the world? And how are you going to do that? So common terms would be vision, values, strategies. So most organizations have those kinds of things. Another piece to this that I think is unique, if we're talking about a regenerative concept, is leaders often put so much emphasis on, well, this is what we've agreed to. Here's our purpose. Here are our strategies. Here's the projects. Let's go do them and produce these outcomes. But what we're not really thinking about as much is what conditions do we need to create in order for people to be able to deliver those outcomes, to be able to realize those strategies. And so that leads people to focus a lot on problems, challenges, issues. Like, oh, this came up. What am I going to do about it? We missed our goal. What am I going to do about it? And when we're thinking that way, now we start looking at, well, whose responsibility was it to achieve that goal? And why did they fall off short? why did they come up short? And so we start looking at how we're going to fix the person so that they can do more. But if we back up from that and we look like it's an ecosystem and we consider what created the conditions for that goal to be missed, now we start seeing totally different things. Like, did everybody understand what the goal was? Was it a realistic goal? Did it directly connect to our purpose in a way that was clear? Or was it confusing and people found themselves like a little bit of dissonance about that goal because it didn't make sense? Did they have the tools that they need? Do they have access to the information that they need? Do we have a collaborative environment? Is someone's genius missing? Now we see all kinds of things that we don't see when we're just trying to solve the problem. And that's the crux of creating conditions, looking much, much higher.
I love that so much. And so then when you were working with, and kind of now on this, in this team environment, where now suddenly you're experiencing leadership, is that a way to maybe describe it?
I think that I was honest, if I'm honest, Kendra, as the leader, the decision maker, I mean, I was fortunate enough to have positions where I could just make the decisions. The context was up to me. I could decide, this is our vision, let's go. And I could rally people to do it. And so I had all the context, all the information I need all the time to make any decision on the fly. I could approach the most challenging situation. I would know how to do it because I was the keeper of all that context. And then when I went to another organization, I didn't have that. So I had to be just like everybody else, looking around saying, all right, here's the project. What's the basis for my decision making? How should I approach this? What decisions fit this environment? What don't? How fast can I make a decision? Do I need to collaborate with other people? How much collaboration do I need? And I literally had no idea how to function because I had to look around at what was around me as my cues. And the biggest eye-opening thing that has ever happened to me in my entire business career was realizing we let people work that way all the time. And we think nothing of it. I told them the goals. Like, why are they not figuring it out? But they weren't part of creating the context for themselves. So how in the world could they know what to do like a decision maker would?
So how's it going to change you as a leader now with that experience?
I think it changed me more than just as a leader. I believe it gave me a pretty healthy dose of humility to recognize, wait a minute, as a decision maker, our ideas aren't better than anyone else's. We are not more important than anyone else. We have to slow down. We have to have margin. We cannot lead pants on fire all day long and expect people to know what to do. And I think that so much of my attention was on what I thought was important. And the biggest thing that shifted for me is now I realize my attention needs to be on what they think is important and really understanding, what do they see when they look at this company? What do they see when they look at their job? How do they experience my environment? And do everything I can to help them grow in their ability to make decisions, not for me, the leader, to be the decision maker. I think if we spent all our time equipping people to be the decision maker, things would go much better for us as leaders.
Wow. So then another big component of this then is obviously communication. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the source almost, is having constant or really relevant and intentional communication.
Yeah, it is. And when I first started learning the regenerative approach to organizations, communication was the one thing that tripped me up the most, because I thought, well, I am communicating. I communicate all the time. Like, come on. Even back in my days when I was my first job, I got written up on my performance review. You need to communicate more, and I would think, how? I'm communicating all the time. But the analogy that helped me a lot was, if you imagine a garden and all the plants, all the seeds have been put in place, and the gardener comes out to water, but there's one particular area that doesn't get all the any water, there's not going to be nutrients to allow it to grow. And communication is just that. It's like water that delivers the nutrients to the soil so that the plants can grow. And so if we look at our organization that way and we consider, okay, who in my organization hasn't been watered? Who doesn't have enough information, communication, so that they can thrive in their role? Now we start seeing something totally different. It's not, did I deliver a lot of communication? It's who's missing it. Where is it dry in my organization, in my entire stakeholder network, really? Because it can't just work for employees, it has to be the entire ecosystem. Our vendors, our suppliers, our clients, our team members, the stakeholders who help us make decisions. It's, do they have water to understand how to be connected? Because if someone isn't being fed that way, they're going to assume that they have all the information they need to be an intelligent decision maker. And then when they don't make the right decision, we're going to think, what was the matter with them? Because we allowed them to exist on old information. It's hard though. It really is.
Mm-hmm. What size? I mean, this is maybe a loaded question, but this feels like such a new idea and such a new way of leading and being that it doesn't feel like something that could be done in a really large organization from the get-go. It would need to start small, it feels like any ecosystem.
I don't think organizations transform as a whole. I think organizations transform one team at a time. And honestly, I mean, I've seen some incredibly effective organizations that were so healthy. They were doing amazing work, but still they would have projects or teams that would fall apart. And I truly believe that real health comes, this kind of leadership of creating conditions for people to thrive has to happen team by team by team, project by project by project. So if every single project initiative in an organization, people sat down and said, okay, what's the purpose of this project? Do we all understand what that means? What strategies are we going to use? How will we achieve that purpose? Well, who's going to do which role for this project? What's that going to look like? And we all communicated and made it our own. That's how we get to the point where all people in their work have the context they need to be decision makers. And so I think organizations, when they start looking at, well, the whole has to be fixed first, miss the boat, because every day there is a project that's starting, initiative that's moving forward, and we can just focus on creating conditions for those to be healthy, then they will ripple out into the organization.
Wow, that's amazing. So then with the beginning of this, then for the listeners that have, are feeling inspired by this, where would you begin?
That's a great question. What one place would I begin? I think I would start by asking myself the question, what conditions have I created for my team? And just start looking around. What do you see happening? What do you notice? Is there, and I wouldn't notice just behaviors, like look at what's being done, but what's the mindsets? What's the presence of people? How are they showing up? Look at all of that and get information. And then look and consider first, well, what could I do to create new conditions? Like really consider, what would I want it to be? What other conditions would I want? For example, if a team member is disengaged or disillusioned, they're frustrated, consider what created those conditions. What did I do? Oftentimes we might discover we're putting a lot of pressure on the performance, and that person doesn't understand how to make decisions. So they're getting more and more frustrated by the increased pressure, but the lack of clarity on what to do. Whatever it is that we see, once we're actually honest about the conditions, I think that opens up a whole new possibility for us to do something new. The danger is when things are happening and we can't see them for what they truly are.
I totally agree with that. I think so many leaders maybe will have the right energy behind it, but they don't necessarily aren't living it themselves in terms of like the values, right? They might look, like you said earlier, might look great on a wall or in a handbook or on a website, but they're not living them every day. And I think that falsehood leads to such confusion on the team. And because the people are seeing what the leader is really valuing. They're experiencing that. It doesn't matter what's on the wall. They're experiencing how the leader is leading. And if that's incongruent, I think that's where a lot of the churn comes in as well. It's just not being honest about it.
I agree. I mean, I have an example that comes to mind. My intention at one point in my organization was I wanted people to own their roles. I wanted them to be decision makers. I wanted them to take responsibility and do it the way that they saw it instead of doing it the way that I used to do it. I don't think that's unique. I think a lot of leaders have that. But what I didn't see and was unwilling to realize is that my behaviors in the tiny little moments was basically akin to, if you imagine, my coach actually said it this way. Imagine your team is in a circle and they're all sitting in a chair. And there I was walking behind them. And I'd be like, oh, get up for a second. And I would sit down in their chair and could do something. And then I'd get up and move to the next chair. And what I didn't realize is they didn't feel like the chair was theirs because I would sit in it. I imagine sometimes they'd even sit in their lap. And it wasn't until I saw that visual and realized, wait a minute, I can't behave this way. That allowed me to just approach it differently and say, okay, how can I create different conditions for this person to stay seated in that chair and for me to help them thrive in it instead of me having to make them get up and show them how to do it. That one shift is just an example of seeing the conditions differently and being honest. Because until I got up out of those chairs, I was never going to create an environment where people could thrive, ever.
And this ties into really also having and being mindful of what are people's gifts and what is their role and what lights them up, what shuts them down. Because the other thing about that too is I think sometimes leaders are not necessarily appreciative of that someone on your team has a gift and they might do it differently than you would do it. And their gift may even be stronger than yours and your ability, right? But the leader isn't necessarily being fully conscious around saying like, I want to draw the best and help this person be the best person and best version of themselves. I mean, does that play into all of this as well? Because it does in my mind. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think part of it is recognizing how different someone's genius is and what that means. And I remember working with a team member once, and it didn't matter what was happening. Like I would approach it from this way. Oh, I clearly see what's happening. We should do this. And I would get really frustrated because he would start talking about things that to me had absolutely nothing to do with what we were talking about. I'm like, honestly, I just wanted him to stop talking so we could move forward with the solution that I had already decided was the best one. I know that sounds terrible, but that's true. And then finally I realized, wait a minute, he's way over there on the other side of the world. And he actually sees a solution from that way. I remember thinking, you could get here from there. And when I would let him actually talk, I would start to realize that he was seeing a whole array of things I was not. And I bring that up because I believe everybody has a genius, and that genius isn't a skill. It's not a personality. It is a lens you bring to everything you do, the way you see things, the way you approach them. And until we start making decisions with lots of different genius, lots of different lenses, we're not actually having enough diversity of thought for our decisions to be resilient. It's why we make decisions and, oh, wait, we didn't think of that because we didn't actually make room for someone else's genius to expand our view. And it's because in many, many cases, we have no margin. Like we just have to make a decision and get this done. But that isn't the best decision for the organization, and certainly not for people when their voices aren't heard.
I love that. Well, I think that is unfortunately a perfect place to end, although I think we could carry on this conversation for hours. And so, Sara, thank you so much for joining me today and giving us just a taste of this idea. And we'll definitely be having you back to continue this conversation and see how else we can all continue to bring this idea of a regenerative company and workforce into our world. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Kendra.